To us, Emily Dickinson is taking a high mountain deep breath while living among the asphalt.
I am nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody? Are you nobody too? Then there's the pair of us. Don't tell. They banish us. You know, I am nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody? Are you nobody to me? How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell one's name, believe long June, to an admiring bug. Tell one's name, believe long June, to an admiring bug. I am nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody? Are you nobody too? You're nobody to me. I am nobody. Who are you? Banish us. You know, I am nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody? Are you nobody too?
Hello and welcome everyone to our 190th birthday celebration of Emily Dickinson. The music video that just played us into our program today was by an Italian band called Aeneas, and their new album, I think you'll recognize the title, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, was just released on Monday this week. You can find them on Facebook or Instagram to learn more. I am so delighted to be with you today. My name is Brooke. I am the program director of the Emily Dickinson Museum, and I'm coming to you live today from inside the poet's bedroom in the family's homestead in Amherst, Massachusetts. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was born on this day in 1830 at 5 in the morning here in this very house, delivered by Dr. Isaac Cutler to parents Emily Norcross and Edward Dickinson. Some of the best descriptions we have of Dickinson as a very young child come from her Aunt Lavinia, who took Emily to live in Munson for a brief while, Munson, Massachusetts, after the birth of Vinnie, the poet's younger sister. Aunt Lavinia's letters evoke a 3-year-old Emily, then called Elizabeth, an affectionate child who called lightning the fire and who enjoyed making music on the piano. She sometimes spoke too loudly in church, but otherwise she behaved very well indeed. Now, 190 years after her birth, Emily Dickinson is known the world over for her striking poetry and her unique story. In proof of this, for today's celebration, you, our honored guests, have registered from over 50 countries. We believe this breaks the record for geographic representation at any one of the Emily Dickinson Museum programs. So what is it about this poet that touches so many people today? In welcoming guests to the museum, we often say that there are as many versions of Emily Dickinson as there are fans of her work and her legacy. In recognition of that, our celebration today is along the theme of who is your Emily Dickinson? Over the next hour, we will hear from a variety of Dickinson lovers who share with us just what she means to them personally. We'll hear from teachers, students, creatives, and makers of all kinds. We'll also make a paint-by-number portrait. We'll take a flight over Amherst. We'll learn how to make Dickinson's black cake, and we'll talk to some surprise guests from Apple TV show Dickinson. And of course, we want to hear from you too. During our time together in this webinar, please consider signing our virtual guest book. To do this, find the Q&A button in this Zoom program to let us know where you're coming from today, and perhaps leave a few birthday wishes for our favorite poet. We will also ask a few poll questions of our guests in this webinar today. Let's do one now. The poll will pop up in a little box, and you can choose to respond or not. You can also close out that box if you find it distracting. The first poll question is, has Emily Dickinson ever inspired you to create something new? Maybe it was a poem, maybe it was an artwork or a song. Let us know. And while you answer that first question, let's hear from our first group of featured guests who will tell us about their Emily Dickinsons.
Hello, I'm Elena Ortega, Mount Holyoke alumni and former professor of Latin American literature at my alma mater. When I studied at Mount Holyoke English literature, Emily Dickinson was not included in the syllabi. Therefore, I had to read her on my own. And once I started, I never stopped reading her. I read her and studied her all along these years, and I admire her allegiance to sensory experience and abstraction. I most admire her rebellious character, her irony, her complexity, and her immense humanness. At present, now that I'm retired, I'm translating her poems together with Chilean poet Soledad Fariña. I will read one of my favorites, but there are many. This is, according to Johnson, 1510. How happy is the little stone that rambles in the road alone and doesn't care about careers and exigencies, never fears, whose coat of elemental brown a passing universe put on, and independent as the sun, associates or glows alone, fulfilling absolute decree in casual simplicity. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rosemary Dombrowski, and I'm coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona, where I've served as the Poet Laureate for the last 4 years. But I've spent the last 2 years or so channeling Emily Dickinson, which is another way of saying that I had a weird Dickinson encounter, but not just one. Sure, I've taught Dickinson for years, but I'll confess that I always preferred Whitman. His decibel level, his expansive lines, his cavorting, his radical politics, they all spoke to the extroverted Gemini in me. But a year and a half ago, I was gifted Dickinson's fascicles. the reproductions of the little booklets of poetry that she hand-bound for family and friends. And I read them in the order in which she curated them. And not only was I getting to know her more intimately, that's also when I realized that she was a zine-star, a radical, marginalized DIY curator of her own poetry. And that's when I realized that she was my zine-star mother. And that kind of explained everything. I'm not a traditional scholar, despite having a PhD in American literature. I'm a performer and an activist, and a founder of way too many zine presses and quirky community projects, many of which have involved zines. And after learning about the fascicles way too late in my career, I realized I was more like Emily than I would have ever imagined. And in the era of COVID, I found myself tightly quarantined with my special needs son and my 90-year-old mother. And then one day, I found Emily Dickinson in my mailbox. It was just her 8-cent stamp, and I don't even know when it was issued, but that was when the dreams began. And suddenly she was here, in the Sonoran Desert with her white dresses, and she was sliding them between my body and the asphalt during our 50-day heat wave in which the high never dipped below 100 degrees. It's a surreal place to be living in surreal times, and so maybe it didn't seem so surreal for Emily to be here with me. After all, we often turn to the dead, and for me that means dead poets, for comfort during our times of greatest need. As a zine-star, a poet, and a very quirky scholar, Emily owns a part of my soul. Happy birthday, zine-star mother.
My name is Lou Sorrentino. I'm from East Windsor, Connecticut. I had a weird Emily Dickinson encounter in a moment when I was feeling hopeless in her garden. I took a deep breath as I remembered the words I saw in her museum. It felt like she was speaking through me as I wrote this song.
My youthful dreams, they passed away. But in these recent days, I must proclaim what wiser ones did say. I've come to understand, much to my surprise, the thing that I was looking for is right before my eyes. Right before my eyes. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. It sings a song without words. It never stops at all. It never stops. It never stops. It never stops at all. It never stops at all. No one will last forever. We all have heard it's true. But living in this moment is all that we can do. All that we can do. Surrender all your fear and all that does not serve, and be the best that you can be. And sing these words, and sing these words. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. It sings a song without words. It never stops at all. It never stops. It never stops. It never stops at all. Never stops at all. If I could give you what I learned, there's no price I wouldn't pay. And the longing it still yearns to sing what words can't say. It never stops, it never stops, it never stops at all.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much to Eliana Ortega, Rosemary Dombrowski, and Lou Sorrentino for sharing their stories. And thank you to those who responded to our poll. Let's check out some of our results here. Okay. Oh, wonderful. It looks like we have almost 40% of you did create a poem inspired by her. Just a couple of you here created a song, 15% created a piece of artwork. We have so many amazing creative people here on this call. And I will give a shout out to those of you who said, no, I would not paint a picture. I'd rather be the one its bright impossibility to dwell delicious on. Thank you for responding to that. It's amazing to think of all the creative work that Dickinson continues to inspire in us today. And speaking of creative work, in this next segment, we will hear from my colleague Melissa, who is going to show us how to make a paint by number portrait of Dickinson. And for those who wish to print one out, you can do this at home. Just follow the link on the museum's webpage for this event. And when you're done, we hope that you'll post a picture on social media and tag the museum so that we can share it. So now over to Melissa, and then we're going to, while we're on an artistic reverie, we will take flight with pilot James Arnold on his aerial journey over Amherst.
Hi, I'm Melissa Chernoff. I am the program assistant for the Emily Dickinson Museum. I'm new to the museum, but I've been a longtime admirer of Emily Dickinson's poetry. When I refer to her poetry, I'm also including the way in which she lived her life. In honor of her 190th birthday, we thought you might enjoy creating your own version of this iconic photograph of Emily Dickinson. To get started, take a look at the right-hand corner of your printout. You'll see colors listed, 1 through 11, and throughout the printout, you'll see numbers 1 through 11. Each number corresponds with a color and a shape. To begin coloring, just use what you have. If you have crayons, that's great. I'm going to use some colored pencils. I'm going to do a collage on the background, so I think I'm going to use some paper as well. I'll need some glue, a pair of scissors, and I think I'm just going to add some writing instruments. Maybe I'll do a drawing for fun. I've recommended you use white, black, light blue, dark blue, dark red, pink, brown, yellow, purple, green, and peach. If you've never created a paint by numbers image before, think of it as a simple code where the picture itself is divided into shapes and marked with a number, which matches a specific color. Follow the pattern by coloring each shape with its corresponding numbered color, and eventually you will find that your own personal masterpiece will emerge. As you develop your paint by numbers, consider that there are no hard and fast rules. Put your own spin on it. Make it yours.
Good morning. Greetings from southwestern Pennsylvania. My name is Jim Arnold, and I wish to take you on a bit of a tour today, an aerial tour to say the least. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, many of us are unable to be with the people that we love or in the places that we love. And if you're like me, I'm sure you'd like to be in Amherst this week to wish Miss Emily a happy birthday. However, due to the risk involved, we aren't able to make that journey. But there's no risk involved in being above the homestead. So join me as we travel 600 miles north in his 54-year-old little Cessna, and we will circle Amherst, and we will wish Miss Emily a happy 190th birthday from a ship that bears her name. Thank you very much.
Jim Arnold. What a wonderful friend he has been to the museum. This afternoon, I'll be placing 2 white lilies on Emily Dickinson's grave for Jim, who has asked me to do that, and boy, am I glad to do it. He wrote to me after he shared this video, life above the clouds is almost as if you had left the previous world behind and now exist upon the firmament of imagination alone. Flying is poetry. Thank you, Jim, for that exquisite journey, and thank you, Melissa, for the craft. In this next group of featured guests, we will hear about the experience of sharing space with Dickinson and favorite physical manifestations of her presence. So before we do that, it's time to hear from you all with another poll question. Do you have a favorite Dickinson-related object or manifestation? So let me pull up that poll for you. Here comes poll number 2. So while you are answering that question, let's hear from David, Tulip, and Preston.
My name is David Dewar, and I'm coming from Iowa City, Iowa, in the land of the Sauk, Meskwaki, and Iowa peoples. I first met Emily Dickinson when I was in high school, as I was beginning to think of myself as a poet. And later in my life, as I began teaching high school in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in my U.S. Humanities class, I would return year after year with my students, getting to know her more intimately. In 2014, I had the good fortune to attend a National Endowment for the Humanities seminar at Amherst. And in that situation, became even closer friends with Emily. Here are 2 poems. Emily's Fig. To plant a fig tree in New England takes faith and imagination. Rich Connecticut Valley loam, unfiltered sunlight, dew from Mount Holyoke, sinewy twisting branches, 3-lobed leaves, large enough for modesty. First green fig in July, fig pudding, fig jam, fig. Emily, no hope. In the dead still of summer nights, in the perfect acoustics of the homestead attic, she read Shakespeare aloud to herself for hours. At the age of 17, while attending Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, she was asked if she would pledge her life to Christ. No hope of that, she declared. She planned to invest her hope elsewhere. Happy birthday, Emily.
Hello, I am Tulip Chaudhary. I am a writer who lives in Amherst town, the very hometown of my favorite poet, Emily Dickinson. I moved here 7 years back, and ever since I've been attached to the homestead. Whenever I pass by walking by Emily's house, I kind of imagine her standing on the front porch balcony and looking out at the yonder beautiful valleys. And I feel like a very much part of a Pioneer Valley's poets. And as we began reading on art nights in our own living room, I would get a feeling that the sun that touched my feet, if I sat by the window, was the same sun that most likely have touched her too. And it made me feel like such a big part of her, the sense of poetry and the beautiful of language and speaking about the nature and life. And I feel to this day that I'm like a continuous journey of poetry in the Pioneer Valley, in Amherst town, in these times of COVID-19, when we are losing so many lives. I often remember her poem, which began, with the senses of death and dying. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. And her words resonate, bells of truth, with not only death, but living, the nature, spring, summer, autumn, or winter. And I love nature. Whenever I am out under the sky or inside the home, the poet lives within me, and I live within her. Thank you so much for making me a part of the poetic journey with her birthday. Thank you to Emily Dickinson Museum.
Hi, I'm Preston Murray, and I'm from Citrus Heights, California in the United States, and I wanted to take a moment to talk about what Emily Dickinson means to me. And it was really hard keeping my thoughts concise because I could literally talk for hours about the beauty of Emily Dickinson and how wonderful she is, and really the light she's brought into my own life and to so many others. But I wanted to reflect on the first poem that I've ever read of Emily Dickinson's, and I was about 14 years old, and I was struggling with some very deep and very personal tragedy at that time. And the first poem I read was "I died for beauty, but was scarce adjusted in my tomb." And to me, that poem was about two people who had found each other, who had both experienced a type of tragedy, and they were able to find each other and give each other comfort and companionship and different perspectives on that tragedy. And that really is a reflection of what Emily Dickinson has done for me. Anytime I've struggled with feeling a certain way or a situation that I didn't fully understand, I feel that there's always been a poem of Emily Dickinson's that can bring me comfort and that can help me define the way she does in very concise words, very large feelings. And that's part of the beauty of Emily Dickinson. I also truly appreciate that she can mean so many things to so many people, and my personal relationship with her can be different from someone else's, and that too is truly beautiful. I also wanted to take a moment to share two things in the physical world that help me remember Emily Dickinson and help keep me close to her and her memory. The first is an 1891 printing of the poetry of Emily Dickinson. It's one of my most prized possessions. And the second is a tattoo that I have that says, "I have no life but this," which is one of my favorite poems by Emily Dickinson, along with several other symbols about her and her life, including the December birth flower. So happy birthday, Emily Dickinson, 190 years, but you'll live forever in my heart. I love you, and thank you so much to the Emily Dickinson Museum for providing this opportunity for those who love Emily Dickinson to share their feelings. Thank you very much.
Thank you to these wonderful individuals who have contributed to our video collecting project. This project aims to document the many versions of Dickinson that live in the hearts of her fans. So if you would like to participate in this by contributing your own video, there is still time. We will be collecting these through the end of the year, and then we will be creating a virtual exhibition featuring all of these wonderful submissions. So I hope that you'll consider throwing your own in there. Let's review our poll because this is so interesting. 41% of you have said that your favorite Emily Dickinson object or manifestation is something that you read. But then after that, and so we might have expected that, a book of poetry perhaps, a biography maybe, but then we're pretty evenly spread out across something that we hold. So maybe it's an Emily Dickinson stuffed animal, or a piece of artwork, or something that you wear. It could be a tattoo or a piece of jewelry. I actually have an Emily Dickinson tattoo myself. It's her handwriting there on my wrist. So Preston, you and I are one and the same there. Perhaps it's at the museum, your favorite object, or maybe it's outside in nature. And then there are those of us who said no. An amethyst remembrance is all I own. Thanks for doing that poll with us, everybody. Next up, we have a real treat. We have two surprise guests from the new hit show, Dickinson. The Verge hailed the show as the wildest, weirdest, and most earnest show on Apple TV. So during the making of the show, members of the production team and the cast actually visited the museum for inspiration. So it was a great honor to sit down for a conversation with the show's creator, Alena Smith. So let's see that next, followed by a very special message and a favorite poem read by actress Ella Hunt, who plays Susan Dickinson, the poet's sister-in-law and very close confidant, who was born just 9 days after Emily. Alena Smith, it is so great to be here with you, creator and executive producer of Apple TV's award-winning show Dickinson. I'm delighted to be with you as we celebrate Emily Dickinson's 190th birthday this week.
It's so nice to be here. Thank you.
So I'm wondering when you first encountered Emily Dickinson and what was your initial impression, and at what point did you know that she would inspire you to create something?
Well, let's see. I mean, there was a couple different introductions to Emily Dickinson along the way. I'm sure that I read her poetry in high school. I wrote poetry myself in high school. I self-identified as a poet at that time of my life. And then actually, when I had graduated from college, and started to think of myself more as a playwright, I was in the process of applying to grad school for playwriting, actually, and I was given a biography of Dickinson, which is the Alfred Haybecker biography, My Wars Are Laid Away in Books. And I read that book cover to cover as if it was like a juicy 19th century novel. And I think that's where I first started to become obsessed with Emily, the person, with all the biographical facts of her family and this sort of great paradox of Emily Dickinson, which is how did she live a life that looked so small on the outside, but contained such a wild infinitude of imagination and ambition and radical creativity on the inside. So I started thinking about Emily Dickinson in my early 20s. And then it was in my early 30s that I was in Los Angeles trying to become a television writer. And I felt like television was really opening up to more theatrical, poetic types of storytelling. And somehow I got the idea that I wanted to make a sort of weird half-hour show about Emily Dickinson. And I knew even from the beginning that I wanted it to look like a period show on the outside, but have like a wild contemporary soundtrack and language that tests the rules in the same way that Emily uses her own rules for her poems when she was writing them.
I love that, and you certainly, I think, have achieved that. And the show's heroine has been, as played by Haley Steinfeld, has been hailed as this unexpected millennial hero. Sexy Dickinson, I believe, has also been kind of thrown around, or the bad girl of 19th century American literature. So, who is Emily Dickinson to you personally, Alena?
She is. I actually love this question because Emily Dickinson, I think for all of us, for everyone who becomes obsessed with her, she's like this strange well that you can go to over and over and over again and look in and see something a little bit different. You know, she's an inexhaustible resource. She's an enigma. She's an iconoclast. She's a mystery. She's a lot of fun. You know, I think people who didn't know anything about Dickinson were surprised when they heard that the show was a comedy with a pop sensibility. But for those of us who have spent more time in her company, we know that her sense of humor is so wicked and that her poems are laced with ironies. She's a philosopher. You know, Emily Dickinson is somebody who is wrestling with time and space and reality and language and being and death and love and desire and doubt and the biggest concepts that we have. But what's so fabulous and fascinating about her is that she wrestles with these giant concepts on these teeny little pieces of paper in these teeny little compressed lines of poetry with these dashes that break off. And she's a true miniaturist in certain ways, but she's packing it all in.
That idea of Dickinson as a deep well definitely resonates with me. I'm thinking about the way that text, Dickinson's text, as you say, has been so important to you in your relationship with her, of course. And I'm also wondering about back in 2018, I believe it was, you paid the museum a visit. And of course, the museum is a sort of document as well, a document of Dickinson's life. So what did that do for you as a creator of the show to see her home?
Well, it really, first of all, it unlocked the show for me. When I visited the museum, I really felt that, you go to visit Emily's house and you can go next door and stand in Sue and Austin's houses. And these are really haunted spaces, and you can really commune with the spirit of the Dickinsons. And as a creator of a show that ultimately is going to be embodied and have actors taking on these roles and standing in four walls that are, reproductions of the actual space, it's such an incredible gift to actually be able to go there physically and imagine what was it like when Emily would send those letters across the lawn to Sue in her house, or what was it like when Emily would go in her garden or in her greenhouse, or just to sit at that bedroom window and look out at the fields and Amherst and feel that connection to the landscape and the town. So it's so magical to be able to visit the museum, and I'm so grateful and indebted to the museum for staying alive all these years and keeping Emily alive, so that someone like me could come along and be inspired by, the actual space that she lived in, and hopefully, bring a whole new generation of readers into an encounter with Emily Dickinson. I think what's so cool about Emily is that there will always be more to discover of her, and there will be future Emily Dickinsons to come. So, it's not about determining once and for all some fixed truth, because that would be totally antithetical to her poetic spirit, which is always about ambiguity and paradox and more than one way of looking at something.
We dwell in possibility.
That's right.
So, Alena, I know that I personally and many others are so looking forward to season 2, which comes out just next month in January. What are you most excited about for the second season?
Well, I am so excited for everyone to get to spend another season with our fantastic group of characters that also really expands in season 2. I think that the world in general that Emily and her friends and siblings are in, it elevates, it gets a bit more sophisticated, it gets a bit, if dare I say, a little spookier. There's kind of a bit of a psychological thriller aspect to season 2, and it has to do with Emily, stepping beyond the boundaries of her family and experiencing a confrontation with a bigger world, and trying to really answer for herself the question of what does it mean to step into the public eye, and what does it mean to seek fame. So
that's such a good teaser. I can't wait, and I'm glad that we don't have to wait long.
Yeah. Me too.
Thank you so much for being with me today and telling us who you're.
Thank you, Brooke, and happy birthday, Emily.
Happy birthday, Emily. So, Elizabeth, there's also a message from Ella Hunt to play in that video. Whoops, maybe while, yeah, there you go.
Characters that also, if dare to seek fame.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ella Hunt, and I play Sue Gilbert in Dickinson. Happy birthday, Emily. It is the greatest joy to work on a show where we get to explore Emily Dickinson's poetry. I hadn't studied her in school, and reading the script was my first dose of Emily. And since then, I have fallen in love with Emily Dickinson's poetry. I am mystified and shocked and in awe of it. This is one of my favorite poems that we use in season 1 of the show. I'm afraid to own a body. I'm afraid to own a soul. Profound, precarious property. Possession, not optional. Double estate, entailed at pleasure upon an unsuspecting heir. Duke in a moment of deathlessness, and God for a frontier. Happy birthday, Emily.
Wonderful. Thank you to these special guests from Apple TV for those messages. Now, it wouldn't be a birthday celebration without cake. You may not know, actually, that in Dickinson's lifetime in her community, she was equally or maybe even better known for her baking as she was for her poetry. And many of her recipes still exist today. We actually carry a book of these recipes at the museum, and soon we're hoping that we'll be able to help you order them online if you like. Since we couldn't all be together in person to share a slice or two of cake, my colleague Elizabeth sat down for a cup of tea and a chat with a team of bakers from Harvard University's Houghton Library to talk about what it's like to make the poet's famous black cake. So here they are.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Bradley from the Emily Dickinson Museum, and I'm joined today by Emily Hardman, Emily Walhout, and Heather Cole, former colleagues from Harvard's Houghton Library. Heather is now at Brown and Emily Hardman is now at MIT, but we are united this morning over our shared love of Dickinson. For the past 6 years, this team has been preserving some of Dickinson's lesser known but most delicious lines by preparing her black cake.
The black cake was actually an incredibly popular cake of the time, and Dickinson's particular recipe for it is kind of extraordinary in its size, but not in the combination of ingredients or the sort of idea of this richly spiced cake that is blackened with molasses.
Delicious. All of those amazing spices that Dickinson used, and that when we have made the cake, we've ground ourselves, so the aroma just hits you before you even take a bite. And I think everyone's reaction when they try the cake is, oh, this is actually good. It really is. It's very flavorful.
So working at the museum, I've had the privilege of sampling many lovingly baked renditions of Dickinson's recipes, but only once have I had this black cake. And I agree with all of you that it's surprisingly good. It's not the fruit cake of your childhood memories at all. It's a rich and wonderful cake, but it's a huge undertaking as you've just described. So why this cake?
This cake, the original recipe in Emily Dickinson's handwriting, is housed at Houghton Library. Emily, do you want to tell our story?
Sure. So when I was hired at Houghton Library, Emily was incredibly excited because I have an alter ego as a baker. And when I came, she said something to the effect of, have you ever, and if not, would you ever make the Emily Dickinson black cake recipe? And by the way, here it is in the first ingredient, 19 eggs. But okay. Really, I think that we all share a love of, which is trying to really activate collections And there seemed, sort of a perfect opportunity to really go by Emily Dickinson's hand to imagine, all these elements that we kind of know and learn about her by living with her archive, by working in the Emily Dickinson room, by kind of internalizing that sense of her physical stature with the tiny desk and chair, and then imagining her, working this cake recipe. And I think that was our motivation, really.
How hard it is to stir that batter. It's like concrete. And you think of, how much labor it would have taken to physically make a cake without electric mixers, without any of the sort of modern conveniences that we have. What's a milk pan?
We did agonize over that, right? And we called the Emily Dickinson Museum to see if they had any knowledge about this, any insight. And in the end, Emily, would you like to say what happened?
Yes, this is, my mom is a potter, and she created for us a set of milk pans to use. They are pretty straight-walled baking vessels, they were used for baking, but also for milking.
We have to think a lot also about how Emily may have gotten her ingredients. Did she grind the spices? What was her flour like? What did she have for citron? That was the biggest question. And was it the first year, Emily, that you candied our own citron?
Yeah.
I think that actually might have been the most successful. It was the most successful, not only because it was much more tasty, but it added a lot of moisture to the cake.
Even though it's a really kind of conventional cake and conventional ratios, it's so huge. It's really overwhelming. You're like, what are we going to do with 5 pounds of raisins? How do we even process, all of these ingredients? And we've had to make guesses, just in the same way that there are sort of silences or questions throughout any kind of archive. The recipe is just like, we have to try to understand what she might have done or what she might have known.
I love it. I love the size of this recipe and how it really indicates that Dickinson was so social and tied in with her neighborhood and her friends and her family, because this is not a cake that we can imagine her eating by herself.
And it's one of those facts that, like, when you really know that, it's something different about the kind of narrative that you can share, especially with students, to sort of refer to this very specific thing that makes so much sense to people and opens her up in a completely new way.
Cheers to that.
Cheers. Happy birthday, Emily.
Now, if you can't get enough of birthday celebrations, be sure to check out the Houghton's virtual birthday program at 3 p.m. today. That's Eastern Standard Time. And a big thank you to Team Cake. We are now heading into our final group of featured guests who will tell us about their Emily Dickinsons. In this segment, Bruna, Emily M, and Emily A tell us when they first met Emily Dickinson and what she has continued to mean to them. So before we hear from them, let's start another poll and hear from you too. We want to know, how did you first meet Emily Dickinson? So let me set up that poll. Okay, there you go. And now over to our storytellers.
My name is Bruna, and I'm coming to you from Tirana, Albania. To me, Emily Dickinson is passion and power. I first encountered Emily Dickinson's poetry when I was a student at the University of Tirana in Albania. The Emily Dickinson I met back then, though, was an eccentric, a recluse, somebody who never left the house and whose poetry could not be understood by anybody. I don't know if I would have gone back to Emily Dickinson's poetry had I not been assigned to teach a course in 19th century American literature at the same university where I graduated. At the beginning, I struggled together with my students to understand the poems, to make any sense out of them. However, there was always something in them that invited me to explore and try to discover more and more, very much in the sense of it beckons and it baffles. But I think it was through a personal misfortune, losing my younger sister, that I discovered the power in Emily Dickinson's poetry. The poems became my passion to teach and my power to keep going. I have been teaching Emily Dickinson's poetry for 20 years now, and there's hardly any other thing I'd rather do. And there's hardly any day that goes by that I don't read an Emily Dickinson's poem to get empowered and to feel like I want to go on. My favorite Emily Dickinson poem, although it's hard to choose one, is I measure every grief I meet with narrow probing eye, and whenever I'm walking out in nature, I find myself humming, to make a prairie, it takes a clover and a bee.
My name is Emily, and I'm coming to you from Chicago, Illinois. I first met Emily, another Emily, when I was 3. I had taught myself to read, and one of the very first books I remember exploring was Michael Bedard's picture book about her, gifted to me by my uncle when I was born. Growing up autistic, I didn't have many friends, and I often looked to literary figures for a sort of companionship. And I became fascinated by this woman with whom I shared a name and a passion for poetry. We had other things in common too, a love of Shakespeare, a deep appreciation for nature, a preoccupation with death. Reading Emily's poems made me want to write my own. And at first I didn't want to share them with anyone, so I filled up little notebooks and hand-bound little chapbooks with nearly 200 poems. And looking back, I can see Emily's influence in those early poems. I was experimenting with meter, I was experimenting with rhyme and nature metaphors. By sophomore year of high school, I'd finally warmed up to the idea of sharing my poems. And my creative writing teacher furthered my interest in Emily by comparing my own work to hers. And that was the first time I felt like a real poet. Influenced by Emily's wildly experimental voice, I decided to create an experimental voice of my own. So I've definitely moved away from meter and rhyme, but I can see the influence of Emily's poetics, especially in my use of em dashes, dots, and unconventional capitalization. Now I'm in grad school pursuing my MFA in poetry, and I was recently studying Emily over the past semester. And I found out that some researchers believe she may have suffered from manic depression. And this was really eerie because it coincided with my own very recent diagnosis. Whether or not Emily struggled with manic depression doesn't seem to matter, because when we look at her poetry, it's clear she used writing as a strategy to deal with suicidal ideation and drastic fluctuations in her mood and unbridled, overwhelming periods of joy. And I can relate, and I have such a clear understanding of why I connect to her work so much. I ended up going as Emily for Halloween. I am a teacher, and my students absolutely loved it. Emily inspires me to go on. She found reasons to live. She told Thomas Wentworth Higginson, "I find ecstasy in living. The sense of living is joy in us." So to Emily, I say thank you and happy birthday. Did you ever imagine any of this was going to happen?
Hi. I'm nobody. Who are you? Well, my name is Emily, and I'm coming to you from Columbia, South Carolina. And I first met Emily Dickinson when I was in college, working on my BA in English at Lander University in 1996. I was introduced to Emily, and I've never been the same. almost a mirror, but not. I mean, to me, Emily Dickinson is me. Not meaning in a fantastical or grandiose or delusional way. I mean, to me, Emily Dickinson is me, is you. I mean, when I read her, I feel almost as if I've peered into a chamber not many even take the time to go to. You know, I mean, Emily's works have always offered so many layers of understanding and confusion. I've never been bored with Emily. I have always been challenged by her. I have missed her on many occasions. And all along, I have never left a single bit of her work thinking that I know it all, thinking that I know her completely. But to me, Emily Dickinson is me. Aren't we all just on a self-journey anyway? Aren't we all just looking out some sort of window? We're all looking out of the windows to discover and to try to figure out exactly what we see before us. God, religion, life, and love. Happy birthday, Emily.
To share in the beauty of these stories with you is pure joy. My friends, our time together is nearing its end, but before we move on to our final segment, I want to share the results of our poll. I love this because some of you found out through family members about Emily Dickinson, some of you learned about her through friends, but it looks like the overwhelming majority is pretty much equally split between learning about her on your own, and of course we know the soul selects her own society, and then those who learned about her from their teacher, those who learned about her as students. And I love that so many of you met her as students. In this final video today, we are going to hear from a 7th grade class in Vermont who have been studying Emily's work for a whole semester. Every year, Stephen Glazer, their teacher, brings his students to the museum on the poet's birthday to recite her poems and sing songs. And since we couldn't be with them today, we thought it very fitting that they should lead us in the singing of the birthday song. So over to them. See, Elizabeth, have you got that queued up?
I'm having a little technical difficulty. If you have it, you could play it, and if not, I will get it in a moment.
Oh, almost there. Hold on. I got it. I'll share.
Birthday, Emily Dickinson, from the 7th grade class at Crossroads Academy in Lyme, New Hampshire.
In this short life that only merely lasts an hour, how much, how little is within our power.
It was within Emily's power to write nearly 1,800 poems.
Some of these poems were sent in letters.
Other poems are collected into small books called fascicles. A word is dead when it is said, some say. I say
to live wrapped in it. Because her work was saved
and collected
and preserved
and shared,
we get to know her.
Thank you, Emily, for your work. And on your birthday, we would like to sing a poem right back to you. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. The simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is coming to hands I cannot see. For love of her sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. Happy birthday, Emily Dickinson. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Emily. Happy birthday to you.
Oh, thank you to Stephen Glazer and his students. Thank you to Apple TV's Alena Smith and Ella Hunt, to Jim Arnold, to the Houghton Library's Team Cake, and to all who have submitted a video to our Emily Dickinson Collecting Project. And thank you to all of you who came to celebrate with us today. Dickinson famously wrote to her cousin, "We turn not older with years, but newer every day." And through each of you, we see our favorite poet anew, and we thank you for sharing her with us. Don't forget that there are more ways to celebrate today, including the Houghton's program at 3 p.m. And then this evening at 7:30, the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. hosts its tribute to Dickinson, which will feature the museum's executive director, Jane Wald, in conversation with award-winning poet Dorian Laux. And if you enjoyed this afternoon, please consider making a birthday gift to the museum in Dickinson's honor so that we can continue to bring you free virtual programs. To do this or to learn more about our programs, visit us at emilydickinsonmuseum.org. We are wishing you and yours a very peaceful and safe holiday season. And on this first night of Hanukkah, we thought it fitting to leave you with one last song to play us out. This one is by Israeli actress and singer Efrat Ben-Zur, whose critically acclaimed album, Robin, is a collection of Dickinson settings. So while this is playing, remember you can still sign our guest book in the Q&A if you haven't already. Thank you once again, friends, and we will see you soon.